I still remember the precise way the afternoon light used to cut across our living room hardwood floors around 4 o'clock. It was this warm, honey gold slant that made the dust motes look like floating stars, casting a quiet, peaceful glow over everything Sarah and I had built together in our little suburban sanctuary just outside of Austin. We had been married for 4 years, but we'd been together since our sophomore year at UT, meaning we had a decade of shared history, shared jokes, and shared scars. Our house wasn't huge, just a standard 3-bedroom ranch style, with a big backyard for a dog we hadn't gotten around to adopting yet. But it was ours. Every piece of furniture had a story. The mid-century modern coffee table we spent 3 weekends restoring, the oversized velvet couch we bought on credit when we barely had 2 nickels to rub together, the framed indie concert posters from our college days hanging in the hallway. It was a life built on safety, predictability, and an absolute, unquestioning trust. If you had told me back then that the very foundation of my existence could be completely dismantled in the span of a single Tuesday afternoon, I would have laughed in your face. I thought I knew exactly who I was, who my wife was, and where our lives were heading. I was completely blind to the cracks forming right beneath my feet. Then came Mark. Mark had been my best friend since we were 7 years old, growing up in the same humid, tree-lined neighborhood in Houston. We were the kind of friends who didn't need to knock on each other's front doors. We just walked in. We survived middle school awkwardness, high school football benches, bad breakups, and the terrifying transition into adulthood together. He was the best man at my wedding, standing right next to me, adjusting my bow tie before I walked down the aisle, telling me that I was the luckiest guy alive and that he'd always have our backs. And I believed him. Mark was charismatic, the kind of guy who could walk into a crowded bar and leave with 5 new best friends. But he was also chronically unstable when it came to his personal life. While I went into corporate logistics, climbing a steady, boring ladder, Mark chased freelance marketing gigs, cryptocurrency trends, and a string of increasingly volatile relationships. So when he called me one Thursday night in absolute pieces, sobbing into his phone because his latest girlfriend had kicked him out of their apartment, locked his bank accounts, and left his clothes in garbage bags on the curb, my immediate instinct wasn't to hesitate. It was to help. I didn't see a threat. I just saw my brother hurting. I remember turning to Sarah, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed reading a book, and telling her what happened. She frowned initially, a faint line appearing between her eyebrows. She liked Mark, but she always said he carried a chaotic energy that made her uncomfortable, like a storm waiting to happen. But when I pleaded his case, reminding her of how he had helped us move into this very house in the pouring rain, her expression softened. She sighed, tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, and told me that, of course, he could stay with us for a little while, just until he got back on his feet. That was Sarah's nature, or at least the nature I thought she possessed. She was gentle, accommodating, and fiercely loyal to the people I cared about. We agreed on a strict timeline of a few weeks, maybe a month tops, just long enough for him to secure a new apartment and clear his head. Looking back, that conversation feels like the moment I willingly invited a wildfire into my home, handing over the matches with a smile on my face. The first week was actually great. It felt like a nostalgic throwback to our college days. Mark slept on our massive living room couch, the very one Sarah and I had saved up for, and he made sure to keep his mess contained. He'd have a hot dinner waiting for us when we both got home from work, cooking up complex pasta dishes or grilling steaks on the patio while we drank IPAs and complained about our bosses. He was incredibly grateful, constantly thanking Sarah for her hospitality and making her laugh in a way that I hadn't seen in a while. My job had been incredibly demanding lately, requiring me to log 10-hour days and travel to regional warehouses across the state, which left me drained and exhausted by the time I crawled into bed. Having Mark there felt like a relief, because it meant Sarah had someone to talk to, someone to keep her company while I was buried under spreadsheets and supply chain crises. I felt a profound sense of pride in my life. I had a beautiful, loving wife, a successful career, and a lifelong best friend who respected me enough to respect my home. I felt completely invincible. But as the days bled into weeks, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. It wasn't anything blatant at first, just a series of micro-adjustments in the daily routine that left me feeling like a guest in my own home. I started noticing how Mark and Sarah's conversations would abruptly taper off whenever I walked into the kitchen, transitioning into a forced, overly bright discussion about the weather or a local news story. I noticed how Sarah started dressing differently on the weekends, trading her oversized sweatpants and messy buns for form-fitting sundresses and carefully applied makeup, even when we had absolutely no plans to leave the house. When I casually commented on how nice she looked one Saturday morning, she laughed it off, her cheeks flushing slightly, claiming she just wanted to feel human for a change instead of a corporate zombie. Mark, standing by the coffee maker, had offered a quick, casual compliment too, nodding in agreement. It seemed perfectly innocent, a friend validating another friend. But there was a strange, heavy tension in the air that lingered long after the laughter stopped. The real shift happened when my travel schedule intensified. I had to spend 3 days a week in Dallas, leaving early Tuesday mornings and returning late Thursday nights. The first time I left after Mark moved in, I felt a slight twinge of guilt for leaving Sarah with the burden of hosting him alone, but she assured me it was fine. She told me she'd just focus on her yoga classes and her own work, and that Mark was mostly out of the way anyway, looking for jobs on his laptop. When I called her from my hotel room on those nights, our conversations felt strained, truncated by long pauses and distracted answers. She sounded distant, her voice flat, always claiming she was just tired from a long day or about to head to sleep early. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the physical distance between us and my own mounting exhaustion. I trusted her implicitly. I trusted him with my life. The thought of infidelity didn't just seem impossible, it felt like a concept from a completely different universe, something that happened to other people, to broken marriages, not to us. Then came that fateful Tuesday in late October. I was supposed to be in Dallas until Thursday evening, overseeing a major inventory audit that was projected to take days. But by Tuesday afternoon, a massive software glitch froze the entire warehouse system, forcing upper management to call off the audit entirely and reschedule it for the following month. I was suddenly free. My first instinct was to call Sarah and give her the good news. But as I walked out to my rental car in the sweltering Texas heat, a childish wave of excitement washed over me. I decided to surprise her. I imagined her face lighting up when I walked through the door 2 days early, holding a bag of takeout from her favorite Thai place down the street. I pictured the relief of sleeping in my own bed, holding my wife, and finally having a normal, quiet evening without the pressure of work hanging over my head. I drove back down the I-35 with a light heart, singing along to the radio, completely unaware that every mile I traveled was bringing me closer to the total destruction of the life I loved. I pulled into our driveway just after 5:30 in the evening. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and deep orange. Mark's battered silver sedan was parked on the street, and Sarah's crossover was in its usual spot near the garage. The house looked completely normal from the outside, peaceful even, with the porch light already flickering on automatically. I grabbed the Thai food from the passenger seat, unlocked the front door as quietly as possible, intending to creep in and startle her with a hug from behind while she was cooking or watching TV. But the moment I stepped inside the foyer, a strange, heavy silence hit me. It wasn't the empty silence of an unoccupied house. It was a dense, suffocating quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The living room was empty, the velvet couch neatly made up with Mark's blankets, but there was a glass of white wine sitting on the coffee table, still sweating, condensation pooling on the wood. And then, breaking the stillness of the house, I heard a sound coming from the end of the hallway, a soft, muffled laugh that came directly from our master bedroom. That sound went through me like an electric current, freezing the blood in my veins. It was a laugh I knew better than my own name, Sarah's laugh. But it wasn't the polite, casual chuckle she gave during dinner conversations or the tired smile she offered after a long day at the office. It was low, intimate, and breathless, a sound she only made when she was completely unguarded, completely consumed by someone else. For a second, my brain simply refused to process the geography of that sound. It was coming from our bedroom, the space we had painted together, the room where we had whispered our deepest fears and greatest dreams into the dark. I stood there in the foyer, the heavy bag of Thai takeout swinging slightly in my hand, the smell of peanut sauce and curry suddenly making me violently nauseous. My feet felt like they were casting concrete, glued to the hardwood floor, while my heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was certain whoever was down that hall could hear it. I wanted to call out her name. I wanted to yell, to make a joke, to shatter the sudden, terrifying weight that had just settled over the house. But something primitive inside my chest locked my throat tight. Slowly, deliberately, I set the takeout bag down on the entryway bench. I didn't want to make a sound. I took off my leather dress shoes, standing in my socks, feeling the coldness of the floorboards beneath my feet. Every single instinct I had accumulated over 34 years of life was screaming at me to turn around, get back in my car, and drive away. It was the desperate, cowardly part of the human psyche that prefers a comfortable lie to a devastating truth. But my body didn't listen. I began to walk down the hallway, each step feeling like an eternity, the framed indie concert posters on the walls blurring into meaningless streaks of color. The door to our bedroom was cracked open just an inch, a sliver of warm light from the bedside lamp spilling out onto the carpet of the hallway. As I drew closer, the muffled sounds became distinct, translating into a language of absolute betrayal that I couldn't ignore even if I tried. Through the narrow gap in the door, I saw them. My wife, the woman I had promised to protect and cherish until my final breath, was sitting on the edge of our mattress, her back to me. Her hair was down, falling over her bare shoulders in a way that made my chest ache with a sudden, vicious grief. And standing right in front of her, his hands resting familiarly on her waist, was Mark, my best friend. The man who had held my suit jacket at my wedding. The man who had cried with me when my father passed away. The man I had taken into my home out of pure, unadulterated love. He was looking down at her with an expression of intense, possessive adoration that he had never shown to any of the women he dated. He whispered something I couldn't quite catch, and Sarah leaned her head forward, pressing her forehead against his chest with a deep, contented sigh. It wasn't just a physical betrayal, it was the emotional ease of it that broke me. They looked like a couple that had been together for years, completely comfortable in their shared intimacy, completely unbothered by the ghost of my presence that still lingered in every corner of that room. I couldn't breathe. It felt as though someone had reached into my chest and wrapped a fist around my lungs, squeezing until all the oxygen was gone. The world around me tilted on its axis, the familiar walls of my home suddenly feeling foreign, hostile, and surreal. I watched as Mark reached down, gently tilting her chin up to meet his gaze, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a rushed, frantic kiss born of sudden, unstoppable temptation. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply affectionate. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in the hair at the back of his head. The sheer familiarity of the gesture made me feel like I was suffocating. I had seen her do that exact same thing to me 1,000 times. I had felt those exact same fingers in my hair. To see it replicated with the man I called my brother was a psychological violence that completely shattered my perception of reality. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my friendships was a lie. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. It could have been 10 seconds, it could have been 10 minutes. Time lost all meaning, expanding and contracting in the heat of my shock. My mind raced backward through the past month, replaying every strange glance, every abrupt silence, every late-night phone call where Sarah sounded distant. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening, violent speed. The sundresses on the weekends, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way Mark had been so eager to cook and take care of the house. They hadn't been accommodating me. They had been building a life together right in front of my face, using my own generosity and my grueling work schedule as the perfect cover. I had literally handed them the keys to my kingdom, paid the mortgage, bought the groceries, and then stepped aside so they could destroy me. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders until I felt like I was going to drop to my knees. Then, the shock began to curdle into something else. A dark, hot wave of pure fury erupted from the pit of my stomach, spreading through my veins like poison. It was a rage I had never experienced before. something raw and animalistic that blinded my vision and made my hands shake violently. I didn't want to cry anymore. I didn't want to run away. I wanted to tear the house down around them. I pushed the bedroom door open with a force that sent it slamming hard against the drywall behind it, the loud crash echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. They both leaped apart instantly, their faces twisting in a synchronized expression of absolute terror. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening so large I could see the whites all around her irises. Mark staggered backward, his heels catching on the rug, nearly losing his balance before gripping the edge of the dresser to steady himself. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and suffocating. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The warm light from the bedside lamp suddenly felt harsh and interrogative, illuminating the guilt that was practically radiating off their skin. I stood in the doorway, my chest heaving, looking from my wife to my best friend, waiting for the denial, waiting for the lie, waiting for someone to tell me that what I was seeing wasn't real. Sarah was the first to break. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. She reached out a hand toward me, a desperate, instinctive gesture, but stopped herself when she saw the look on my face. "David, you're not supposed to be home until Thursday. What are you doing here?" It was a pathetic question, the desperate reflex of a person caught red-handed, and it only fueled the fire burning inside me. She wasn't sorry for what she was doing. She was sorry she got caught. She was looking at me like I was a monster, like I was an intruder in my own bedroom, interrupting a life that didn't belong to me anymore. I looked past her to Mark, who was standing entirely still, his face completely drained of color, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't say a word for what felt like an eternity. I just stood there in the doorway, watching the two people I loved most in the world look at me like I was a ghost. The silence was deafening, filling up the space between us until the air felt heavy and impossible to breathe. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to say something, waiting for the guy who always had a slick excuse or a quick joke to explain this away. But he just kept his eyes glued to the floor, his shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The sheer cowardice of his posture made the rage inside me flare up even hotter. This was the guy who had stood by my side, the guy I called a brother, and he couldn't even look me in the eye after destroying my life. "David, please," Sarah said, her voice cracking as she finally stepped toward me. She had tears streaming down her face now, her hands trembling as she reached out, but I instinctively took a step back into the hallway, refusing to let her touch me. The movement was sharp, almost violent, and it made her flinch. "It's not what it looks like. Just let me explain, please. We didn't mean for this to happen." "It's not what it looks like?" I repeated, and my own voice sounded completely foreign to me. It was low, hollow, and laced with a cold, venomous sarcasm that I didn't know I was capable of. "So you wasn't just kissing my best friend in our bed?" "I'm sorry, Sarah. Did my eyes deceive me? Please, tell me exactly what it looks like, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sleeping with the guy I brought into our home to help." She choked on a sob, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She looked so fragile, so completely broken, but I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. The protective instinct that had governed my actions for the last 10 years was completely dead, replaced by a cold, unyielding detachment. I looked past her to Mark, who finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, and he swallowed hard before he spoke, his voice raspy and tentative. "Dave, man, look, I'm so sorry," Mark stammered, taking a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "It's my fault, all of it. Don't blame her. I put myself in this position, and I let things get out of hand. I'm so incredibly sorry, bro." "Don't call me bro," I snapped, the words cutting through the air like a knife. The anger was so intense it made my vision blur at the edges. "Don't you dare call me that. You don't get to look at me, you don't get to talk to me, and you sure as hell don't get to apologize to me."
You sat at my dinner table. You drank my beer. You lived in my house, under my roof, while you were planning how to take my wife from me." "It wasn't like that," Sarah cried out, stepping between me and Mark, as if she were trying to shield him from my wrath. That gesture, more than anything else, was the final blow to my heart. Even now, in the wreckage of our marriage, her instinct was to protect him. "It wasn't planned, David. I swear to you. You were gone all the time. I was lonely, I was miserable, and he was just here. We started talking, really talking, about things we hadn't talked about in years. It just happened."
It was a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. Hearing her blame my work, blaming my absence for her choices, felt like a physical assault. I had been working those grueling hours, driving up and down the highway to Dallas, sacrificing my sleep and my sanity so that we could pay off our debt, so that we could build a future together, so that we could afford the life she wanted. I was out there breaking my back for us, and she used that very sacrifice as an excuse to welcome my best friend into our bed. The hypocrisy of it was suffocating. "A mistake?" I whispered, staring at her. "A mistake is spilling coffee on the rug, Sarah. A mistake is forgetting to lock the back door. This is a choice. Every single day I was gone, you made a choice. Every time you looked at him, every time you dressed up for him, every time you let him touch you, you chose to destroy us. Don't you dare sit here and tell me you were lonely when you had a husband who loved you more than anything." She looked at me, her eyes wild with a mixture of guilt and fear, realizing that her excuses weren't going to work. The veneer of our perfect life had been completely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but the ugly, raw truth of what they had done. I looked at the two of them standing together in the bedroom, and a wave of profound exhaustion suddenly washed over me, replacing the hot anger with a cold, dead weight. I didn't want to yell anymore. I didn't want to hear their excuses, their apologies, or their tears. I just wanted them out of my sight. I looked at Mark, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get your stuff and get out of my house. If you are still here in 5 minutes, I swear to God, Mark, I will throw everything you own into the street and call the police. Move." Mark didn't hesitate. He nodded quickly, his face pale, and immediately began grabbing his clothes from the dresser and his duffel bag from the closet. He didn't look at Sarah, and he didn't look at me. He just started packing with a frantic, desperate energy, his hands shaking as he stuffed his belongings into the bag. Sarah watched him, her mouth open in a silent gasp, realizing that the fantasy they had been living in was officially over. The reality of the consequences was finally crashing down on them, and there was no turning back. I walked out of the bedroom, leaving them to their frantic packing, and went back to the living room. I stood by the large front window, looking out at the quiet, peaceful suburban street. The neighborhood was so calm, so normal. A neighbor was walking their dog down the sidewalk, the street lights were flickering on, and cars were pulling into driveways as people returned home to their families. Inside my house, my entire world had just been obliterated. But outside, the rest of the world was just keeping on spinning, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding behind my front door. I felt a profound sense of isolation, like I was the only person left alive in a ruined landscape. A few minutes later, I heard Mark's heavy footsteps coming down the hallway. He carried his oversized duffel bag and a loose pile of coats in his arms. He stopped at the edge of the living room, hovering in the doorway, looking at me with a pathetic, pleading expression. He opened his mouth, likely to offer one last useless apology, but I didn't even turn around to look at him. I just kept my eyes fixed on the street outside. Recognizing the absolute finality of the silence, he turned and walked out the front door, closing it quietly behind him. A moment later, I heard his car engine turn over, the headlights sweeping across the living room walls as he pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night. He was gone, leaving behind the wreckage of a 27-year friendship that could never, ever be repaired. Then I heard the soft sound of Sarah's bare feet on the hardwood floor behind me. I didn't turn around immediately. I just watched the taillights of Mark's car fade into the darkness of the suburban street, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest.
When I finally turned, Sarah was standing at the edge of the kitchen, looking incredibly small. She had changed into an old, oversized college sweatshirt, one of mine, ironically, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She looked stripped of all the confidence she had carried just an hour prior, standing in the wreckage of the life we had spent a decade building together. She looked like a stranger wearing my wife's face. "Is he gone?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the room. "He's gone," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of the anger that had consumed me just minutes ago. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow expanse of numbness. "And you need to figure out where you're going to." She flinched as if I had struck her, fresh tears immediately welling up in her eyes and spilling down her cheeks. "David, please, don't do this. Don't just throw me out. We can talk about this. We can go to counseling. People survive things like this. We have 10 years together. You can't just throw 10 years away in one night." "I didn't throw it away, Sarah," I said, my voice steady, sounding remarkably calm even to my own ears. "You did. You threw it away every single time you looked at him while I was gone. You threw it away every time you let him touch you in the bed I paid for. I'm just the guy cleaning up the debris." She walked over to the velvet couch, the very one where Mark had been sleeping, and sank into it, burying her face in her hands. Her body shook with heavy, ragged sobs that echoed through the quiet house. I stood there watching her, waiting to feel something: grief, pity, maybe a lingering spark of the love I had carried for her for a third of my life. But there was nothing, just a vast, empty void where my future used to be. Every shared memory, every vacation, every late-night conversation about starting a family, it all felt retroactively poisoned, tainted by the sheer scale of her deception. "I was just so lonely, David," she choked out through her fingers, repeating the same pathetic refrain. "You were always working. You were always in Dallas or Houston or Austin. I would sit in this house for days by myself, just listening to the walls creak. Mark was just here. He listened to me. He made me feel like I existed." "I was working for us," I said, the words falling like stones between us. "I didn't want to be in those hotels, Sarah. I didn't want to be driving hundreds of miles a week, eating bad takeout alone in a room, missing you. I did it because we wanted a family. We wanted to pay off the mortgage. I thought we were a team. I thought we were sacrificing together for a future. But while I was out there building it, you were tearing it down from the inside." She didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there, weeping quietly into her hands, the reality of her choices finally setting in. The illusion of her secret romance had been shattered, replaced by the cold, unforgiving light of a Tuesday evening in an empty house. There was no grand romance here, no tragic love story. It was just a cheap, sordid betrayal, born of boredom and a complete lack of respect for the man who loved her. I walked down the hallway to our bedroom. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a crime scene. The sheets were still rumpled, the bedside lamp still casting its warm, ironic glow over the space. I grabbed a large duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet and began throwing my clothes into it. I didn't want to stay in this house tonight. I couldn't sleep in that bed, and I couldn't sit on that couch. Every corner of this place was contaminated by their presence. I packed enough clothes for a week, my laptop, my passport, and my basic toiletries. My movements were mechanical, precise, and completely disconnected from my emotions. I was operating on pure survival instinct. When I walked back out to the living room, Sarah looked up, her eyes widening when she saw the bag in my hand. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "David, please don't leave. Stay here. Let's talk. Don't leave me alone." "I'm going to a hotel," I said, walking past her toward the front door without stopping. "I'll have my lawyer contact you tomorrow morning." "I want you out of this house by noon. You can take your clothes and your personal things, but leave the keys on the kitchen counter.
If you're still here when I get back tomorrow afternoon, I'll have the locks changed and your things moved to a storage unit." "David, please," she screamed, rising from the couch and running toward me, but I was already at the door. I opened it, stepping out into the cool, crisp Texas night air. It felt incredibly fresh against my skin, clearing the suffocating fog of the house from my lungs. I looked back at her one last time. She was standing in the doorway, framed by the warm light of the home we had built together, looking utterly broken and desperate. Just a few hours ago, I would have done anything to protect her from that kind of pain. Now, I felt absolutely nothing. "Goodbye, Sarah," I said quietly. I walked down the porch steps, my dress socks clicking slightly against the concrete before I slipped my shoes back on. I tossed my duffel bag into the back seat of my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror. Sarah was still standing on the porch, a small silhouette against the light, watching me drive away. I didn't look back again. I drove down the familiar streets of my neighborhood, passing the identical houses with their neat lawns and glowing windows, wondering how many other secrets were hiding behind those pretty front doors. I felt completely untethered, floating in a dark, empty space with no idea where I was going to land. The life I had known was gone, completely obliterated in the span of a single afternoon by the two people I trusted most. But as I turned onto the highway, heading toward downtown, a strange, quiet sense of clarity began to settle over the numbness. The truth was brutal, and it had destroyed my world. But at least the lie was over. I was finally breathing real air again, even if it was in the middle of a wreckage.